The salt air bit at my lungs like a curse the moment I stepped onto the Wraith Eye. Each breath felt heavy, laden with the weight of choices that had led me here. October in Apalachicola meant the air hung thick with brine and regret, and I inhaled both deeply, tasting the metallic tang of fear that had trailed me all the way from Miami. The trawler's hull, encrusted with barnacles, groaned like a coffin settling into the earth. Somewhere in the wheelhouse, the radio crackled with static, sounding like an angry ghost refusing to find peace. I'd been on the run for 3 weeks since everything imploded. The smuggling operation I'd carefully built over 2 years, meticulous routes through the Keys, reliable contacts in Nassau, a network that moved everything from Cuban cigars to Venezuelan pharmaceuticals, had crumbled in a single night when I made the call that saved my own skin and damned my crew. The Coast Guard had been closing in, their intel too precise, their timing too perfect. Someone had been feeding them information, and I made damn sure it wasn't me who went down for it. Self-preservation had always been my forte, learned in foster homes where you ate or went hungry, perfected in juvenile detention where weakness meant blood staining the concrete. Watching Carlos and Miguel get hauled away in cuffs while I slipped out the back of that Coconut Grove bar. That guilt gnawed at me like rust-consuming metal, leaving holes I couldn't repair. The Gulf was supposed to be my escape, a place to vanish until the heat died down. I hadn't expected it to pull me under in ways I couldn't have imagined. Maria Santos found me at Mira Torres's bait shop on a Tuesday morning when the fog hung so low you could almost taste it. I was nursing coffee that burned like diesel fuel and staring at job postings that might as well have been written in some dead language. Commercial fishing, deckhand, boat maintenance. Honest work for someone who'd spent the last decade existing in the gray areas between legal and profitable. She was 60-something, with sea-weathered hands that looked like they could strangle a shark and eyes as sharp as fishhooks. Her gray hair was pulled back, severe, salt-stained, and practical, and she wore an expression that suggested she'd witnessed things most people wouldn't believe. When she moved, it was with the careful efficiency of someone who'd spent decades working in confined spaces where one wrong step could mean the difference between going home and feeding the fish. "You the one looking for boat work?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from me. Her voice carried the weight of years spent shouting over engine noise and storms. Rough as barnacles but not unkind. "Depends what kind of work." I'd learned to be wary of commitments, especially from strangers who appeared like answers to prayers I hadn't even prayed. Honest work, fishing, maintenance, keeping the peace. She studied me like she was reading tide charts, taking in the nervous energy I couldn't quite mask, the way my eyes kept darting to the door, the careful distance I maintained between myself and the other customers. "You remind me of my boy, Tommy Reeves." He had that same look, like he was carrying something heavy. I didn't ask what happened to Tommy Reeves. In places like this, surrounded by memorial plaques for fishermen who never returned and Coast Guard photos of successful rescues, that question usually led somewhere dark. But the way her voice caught on his name told me enough. "Wraith Eye's been my boat since 1984, Maria Santos continued, pulling a thermos from her canvas bag and pouring coffee that steamed like fog. "She's old, but she's got good bones. 73-foot shrimper, converted for fishing charters and fuel stops. Need someone who can handle the night shifts, deal with all kinds of customers. Fishermen heading out before dawn, Coast Guard boys doing their rounds, tourists who couldn't tell a cleat from a capstan. The pay was decent, better than I had expected for legitimate work. $300 a week plus tips, cash every Friday, no questions about references or background checks. Room and board included. A small cabin below decks that she assured me was clean and private. It was exactly what I needed. Invisible work that paid enough to send money to Nora for Lily's expenses, far enough from Miami to avoid unwanted questions. "There are rules," Maria Santos said, reaching into her bag again and pulling out a salt-stained piece of paper. The ink faded but still legible in her precise handwriting. 6 of them. "Follow these exactly. No shortcuts, no exceptions, no interpretations. This coast's older than most people realize. Sane fishing grounds going back centuries, pirate wrecks from the 1700s, Spanish treasure fleets that never made it home. The Gulf remembers everything, and it doesn't forgive carelessness." I read the first rule. Always acknowledge the rider's light. Never hide. What's the rider? I asked, but Maria Santos was already standing, shouldering her bag with the practiced motion of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. You'll know when you see it, she said. Just remember, you don't hide. You let it see you clearly so it passes by. The dead don't like to be ignored, but they respect those who show proper courtesy. The first week passed quietly, almost peacefully. I learned the Wraith Eye's rhythms. The way her diesel engine coughed to life each morning like an old man clearing his throat. How the nets needed constant mending because the Gulf's currents carried debris that sliced through nylon like razors. Where to stack the fuel cans so they wouldn't shift in rough seas and turn the deck into a skating rink of spilled gasoline. The boat was a 1970s relic, all rusted deck plates and sun-bleached wood, but Maria Santos maintained her like a shrine. Every morning, she'd walk the perimeter, checking lines and testing equipment with the methodical precision of a ritual. The wheelhouse was cramped but organized, charts rolled and secured, radio equipment that looked like military surplus but worked better than anything I'd seen on newer boats. During daylight, we catered to the fishing community that plied these waters. Commercial fishermen, heading out to the deeper channels, would swing by for fuel and bait, their boats laden with ice and a hopeful spirit. The Coast Guard paid us regular visits, their young officers courteous but ever watchful, casually inquiring about boat traffic and any unusual sightings. I answered with the careful neutrality of someone who had nothing to conceal. Tourists also came, retirees in pristine boats buying overpriced snacks and asking about the prime fishing spots, their enthusiasm contagious despite their blatant inexperience. Maria Santos treated them all the same. Fair prices, sound advice, and the kind of maritime courtesy that had kept her afloat for 4 decades. But at night, the Gulf transformed. Fog, thick as sorrow, would roll in, muffling sounds and turning distant lights into dancing will-o'-the-wisps. The radio would pick up strange transmissions. Snippets of Spanish from fishing vessels not on any chart, children singing nursery rhymes in languages unknown to me, and sometimes what sounded like sane chanting carried on winds that seemed to originate from nowhere. Old waters hold voices, Maria Santos told me one evening, her hands steady as she mended a net by lamplight. The Sains fished these waters for 1,000 years before the Europeans arrived. Spanish treasure fleets used to seek shelter in these bays during hurricane season. Pirates careened their ships on these beaches. The dead don't always realize they've stopped breathing, and the Gulf doesn't forget. I learned to block out the radio's unsettling moods, to focus on the work that kept my hands occupied and my mind away from the weight of history. But sometimes, in the quiet hours after midnight, when only the running lights marked our presence on the dark water, I'd find myself listening for something I couldn't quite define. The second week brought the light, and with it, my first true lesson in the rules that governed life on the Gulf Wraith. It was 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday when I first spotted it. A single point of white light moving across the water about a quarter mile out, steady and purposeful in a way that made my smuggler's instincts prickle. Too steady to be a boat riding the evening swells, too bright to be a standard fishing light, and moving at a speed that suggested significant power. I was cleaning the coffee station in the wheelhouse, scrubbing salt stains from the metal counter, trying to avoid thinking about the call I'd need to make to Nora tomorrow. Another excuse for why the money would be late, another promise that things were improving. The radio was cycling through weather reports and fishing advisories, background noise I'd learned to tune out. Then Maria Santos appeared in the doorway, as if she'd materialized from the fog itself, moving faster than I'd seen since she hired me. Her hands flew to the control panel, flipping on the deck lights and throwing open the wheelhouse door in one swift motion. Cool air rushed in, carrying the scent of salt and something else. Something old and damp, like the interior of a cave that had never seen sunlight. "Come on," she said, not looking back as she stepped onto the deck. I followed her into the night air, abandoning the relative warmth and safety of the wheelhouse for the open deck where the fog swirled around us like living entities. The light had stopped moving and seemed to be observing us. A single point of heat and illumination that made the October air shimmer like summer pavement. "You don't hide," Maria Santos said, her voice steady despite the strangeness of the moment. "Rule number 1. Let it see you clearly, so it knows you're not what it's looking for. We stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes. The light holding its position while fog gathered around it like a living thing drawn to warmth. I could feel heat radiating from it despite the distance, making my skin prickle with sweat and something deeper. A primal awareness that I was in the presence of something that didn't belong to the world I understood. Then, without warning, it moved again. The light slid north along the coast, following the shoreline with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. It vanished into the deeper waters where the commercial fishing boats worked their nets, leaving behind only the familiar darkness and the sound of waves against the hull. 20 minutes later, a tourist boat limped into our dock. Their 40-foot bell liner should have been running smoothly on a calm night like this, but she was barely making headway, her engine coughing like a sick dog. The captain, a sunburned retiree from Alabama named Pete, tied off with hands that shook so badly I had to assist him in securing the lines. "Damnedest thing," he kept muttering as Maria Santos and I helped him and his wife aboard. Radio just went dead. GPS started spinning like a compass near a magnet. Depth finder showing readings that can't be right. Engine temperature spiked, then dropped to nothing. Never seen anything like it in 30 years of boating. His wife, Martha, clutched a life jacket like a talisman and kept glancing at the water as if she expected something to surface. "There was a light," she said quietly while Pete was below checking their engine. Bright as the sun, but cold. Made the air feel thick, like breathing underwater. Maria Santos waived their docking fee and sold them fresh batteries at cost, checking their radio and GPS with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that mechanical failure on the water could be the difference between a story to tell at the marina and a Coast Guard search. Everything functioned perfectly once they'd been at our dock for an hour. Their instruments reading normal, their engine purring like new. After they left, they were putting slowly toward the marina with their running lights steady and bright. Maria Holt poured coffee from her thermos, the steam curling like a phantom's breath in the cold air, and gestured for me to sit at the small table in the wheelhouse. The radio, fighting for signal, suddenly crackled to life, spewing out wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, despite being tuned to a weather station. The mournful melody drifted across the water, a somber hymn for the lost. "That was the drowned rider," Maria Holt said, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup as if trying to coax warmth from the ceramic. "His name was Elias Cole. Died in 1987 when his boat went down during a Coast Guard chase. He was a smuggler like you used to be, Silas Ward. Fast boat, knew all the good routes. Thought he was smarter than the law." The coffee tasted acrid, like ash coating my tongue, but I kept drinking it, needing the jolt. "What happened to him?" I asked. "The Coast Guard cornered him near the Barrier Islands during a storm. He was running drugs from Mexico. Had a reputation for being too clever by half, always pushing the envelope. When they boxed him in, he chose the water over prison, pushed his engines past red line, and tried to outrun them through the shallows." Maria Holt's eyes glazed over, unfocused, looking past me toward the unforgiving dark water. "Boat broke apart on the reef. They found pieces washing up for weeks afterward, scattered across the tide lines, but never found him. And now he searches these waters endlessly for the boats that chased him that night. The light you saw, that's his boat still trying to outrun what caught him. The dead don't always understand they've stopped breathing, especially the ones who died angry, full of resentment." She fixed me with that hook-sharp stare, a gaze that seemed to penetrate any pretense, any mask I might be wearing. "Cole searches for Coast Guard cutters, enforcement boats, anything that reminds him of what killed him. Sometimes he decides civilian boats are threats too, especially ones with equipment that looks official. Acknowledging him, showing respect, keeps him from deciding your Coast Guard or competition or just in his way." Maria Holt's fingers drummed against the table in a nervous rhythm, a beat that echoed the ceaseless waves against the hull. "The rules aren't suggestions, Silas Ward. They're survival instructions, written in other people's blood. This coast has been taking lives for centuries, and the only reason we're still here is because people before us learned how to show proper respect." I looked down at the rule sheet, now damp with salt spray and the grime of handling. 5 more rules waited below the first, their implications making my stomach clench with the grim realization that my new job was far more complicated, far more dangerous than I'd bargained for. Outside, a lone gull cried once, the sound echoing across the fog-shrouded gulf like a scream torn from the throat of something that had witnessed too much. The radio static shifted and changed, a restless hum, and for just a moment, I swore I heard the distant, fading rumble of engines that would never reach shore, pushing past red line in a race that had been over for 38 years. The Gulf Wraith rocked gently in her slip, a subtle tremor, and I realized with chilling clarity that I wasn't just working on this boat. I was becoming part of whatever ancient contract, whatever dark bargain, kept these waters from claiming everyone who dared to cross them. The rules weren't just guidelines for employment. They were the terms of survival in a place where the past refused to stay buried, where the dead still sought vengeance. By the third week, I'd fallen into the Gulf Wraith's rhythm, the ebb and flow of its daily life, like a man learning to breathe underwater, slowly adjusting to the pressure. The morning routine started before dawn, the sky still bruised with the remnants of night. Check fuel pumps, test radio equipment, brew coffee that burned like diesel and tasted faintly of rust. The work wasn't intellectually complicated, but it demanded a relentless, unwavering attention, the kind that kept my mind from wandering to places better left alone, like the crew I'd betrayed back in Miami, or the money I still owed Nora for Lily's school expenses, an ever-growing debt that kept accumulating no matter how many promises I made. The oil-slick air hung heavy around the boat, thick with the mingled sense of salt and diesel fumes that burned my throat like regret made manifest, a tangible reminder of my failures. Every breath tasted of decisions I couldn't take back, of choices that had led me from the gleaming towers of Miami's smuggling operations to this weathered dock in the Florida Panhandle, a descent into the shadows. But there was something honest about the work, something clean in the simple routine of maintenance and service, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years of moving contraband through international waters, a chance at redemption. Maria Holt had me learning net mending, sitting on deck in the late afternoon sun, the heat radiating off the planks, with my clumsy fingers working through the nylon mesh while she showed me how to spot the subtle signs of wear, the almost invisible fraying that could cost a fisherman his livelihood. Her weathered hands moved through the repairs with practiced ease, decades of muscle memory guiding every knot and splice, a testament to a life lived on the water. The work was meditative in its way, requiring a singular focus that pushed away the constant background noise of guilt and worry that had followed me from Miami like a persistent shadow, a haunting echo of my past. The Gulf doesn't give second chances, she'd say, her voice carrying the weight of 4 decades on these waters, a lifetime of hard lessons learned. Equipment fails out there, you're swimming with things that don't care about your mortgage payment or your kid's birthday party. The sea takes what it wants, when it wants it, and all you can do is show proper respect, acknowledge its power. The fishermen who stopped by treated me with the cautious courtesy reserved for newcomers, strangers who might not last the season, interlopers in their world. They'd nod politely, their eyes narrowed in assessment, pay for fuel and bait with crumpled bills that smelled of salt and honest work, ask careful questions about weather patterns and Coast Guard schedules, probing for weaknesses, for signs of inexperience, that I answered with the neutral professionalism I'd learned in less legal enterprises, a mask of competence. Some had been working these waters since before I was born, their faces etched with the harsh realities of the sea, their boats extensions of themselves, their knowledge earned through storms and near misses that would have sent lesser men looking for desk jobs in Tallahassee, seeking the safety of dry land. The older captains had a way of looking at you that suggested they could read your history in the set of your shoulders, the way you handled lines, whether you instinctively checked escape routes when you entered a new space, a silent judgment passed with a glance. They didn't ask direct questions about my background, but I could feel them cataloging details, piecing together fragments of information, forming opinions about whether I'd. The older captains had a way of looking at you that suggested they could read your history in the set of your shoulders, the way you handled lines, whether you instinctively checked escape routes when you entered a new space, a silent judgment passed with a glance. They didn't ask direct questions about my background, but I could feel them cataloging details, piecing together fragments of information, forming opinions about whether I'd stick around when the work got hard or the weather turned dangerous. Coast Guard boys were friendlier, young officers buying overpriced coffee and asking casual questions about boat traffic that I answered with careful neutrality. They never pushed, never made me feel like they suspected anything about my past, but I could feel Carlos watching, the way good cops always did. Professional curiosity, not suspicion, but the kind of attention that kept me honest in my answers and careful in my movements around federal law enforcement. During the daylight hours, the Gulf felt almost normal. Tourists in spotless boats would stop for snacks and directions. Their enthusiasm infectious despite their obvious inexperience. They'd ask about the best fishing spots, the safest routes to the barrier islands, whether the weather was going to hold through the weekend. Commercial fishermen would fuel up before heading to deeper waters, their holds packed with ice and hope. Their conversations focused on practical concerns like fuel prices and fish populations that had nothing to do with supernatural rules or ghostly lights. But at night, the Gulf changed into something older and stranger, something that belonged to a different world than the one governed by Coast Guard regulations and maritime law. Fog rolled in, thick as grief, muffling sounds and making distant lights dance like spirits seeking rest. The radio picked up signals that shouldn't exist. Snatches of Spanish from boats that weren't on any chart, children singing nursery rhymes in languages I didn't recognize. Sometimes what sounded like sane chanting carried on winds that came from no particular direction and tasted of salt and sorrow. Old waters hold voices. Vera told me during one of these evening shifts, her hands steady on a net she was mending by lamplight. This coast's been taking lives for centuries. Sane fishing parties, Spanish treasure fleets, pirate crews, commercial fishermen, smugglers like you used to be. The dead don't always understand they've stopped breathing, and the Gulf doesn't forget the debts it's owed. The man with silver coins appeared Thursday night at 10:30 p.m., emerging from the fog like he'd been walking on water for longer than should be possible. There I was cleaning the fuel station, scrubbing salt stains from the metal counter and trying not to think about the call I'd need to make to Nora tomorrow. Another explanation for why the money would be late. Another promise that things were getting better. Another lie about the legitimate work I was supposedly doing in this forgotten corner of Florida. The radio was cycling through weather reports and fishing advisories. Background noise I'd learned to filter out during my weeks aboard the Gulf Wraith Eye. He was mid-40s, wearing a weathered yellow slicker that looked like it had seen decades of Gulf storms and salt spray. His face was hard to focus on directly, the kind of features that seemed to shift when you weren't looking right at them, like heat distortion over summer pavement or mirages on distant water. He moved with the careful balance of someone accustomed to shifting decks, but there was no boat tied at our pier, no engine sound carrying across the water to announce his arrival from the darkness beyond our lights. "Need fuel," he said, his voice carrying the flat accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Spanish first, learned English as a necessity for commerce rather than comfort. 10 gallons, regular. I filled his canteen, military surplus, worn smooth by handling and years of use, and watched him count out payment with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this transaction many times before. 3 silver coins, tarnished and heavy, each bearing the profile of some long-dead king I didn't recognize, Spanish colonial, maybe, or Confederate, the kind of currency that belonged in museums rather than modern maritime commerce. They felt cold against my palm when he dropped them into my hand, colder than the October night air, and they seemed to whisper when they touched my skin. Not words exactly, but the kind of sound that made you want to check over your shoulder for things that shouldn't be there. The weight was wrong too, heavier than silver should be, as if they were made of something denser and more permanent than ordinary metal. "That'll cover it," he said, tipping his cap with old-world courtesy that belonged to a different century, a different understanding of how business should be conducted between strangers on dark water. I pocketed the coins without thinking, my attention caught by movement in the fog behind him. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw the outline of a boat, something sleek and fast, with lines that suggested it had been built for speed rather than comfort or cargo capacity. But when I looked directly, there was nothing but gray mist and dark water rolling against our dock with the endless patience of the sea. "You're not from around here," I said, but when I looked back, he was gone. His canteen had vanished too, along with the fuel I'd dispensed. The pump showed 0 gallons transferred, as if the transaction had never happened, as if I'd imagined the entire encounter. Only the coins remained, burning cold in my pocket like stolen ice. their weight somehow greater than when I'd first held them. My fingers tingled where I'd touched them, and somewhere in the distance, I heard faint children's laughter carried on wind that tasted of brine and sorrow. That's when Vera appeared in the wheelhouse doorway, moving faster than I'd seen since she hired me, her sea-weathered face tight with controlled alarm. "He's not trouble," she said, her eyes scanning the empty pier with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to read danger in the set of waves and the color of clouds. "Just passing through." Her expression went granite hard when she saw my face, the way my hand kept moving toward my pocket where the coins waited like a guilty secret. "What did you take from him?" I pulled the coins from my pocket. Their weight felt impossibly heavy, defying the laws of physics. Maria Santos glanced at them, and a string of Spanish curses erupted from her lips, words that seemed to amplify the radio static, turning it into a painful screech in my ears. "Rule number 2, she said, her voice strained with barely suppressed fury. "Never accept silver coins as payment. Dead sailors have no need for change, and they resent being turned away with empty hands." She guided me to the wheelhouse, revealing a panel beneath the helm I hadn't noticed before. Inside, a wooden box, aged and weathered by salt air, contained dozens of similar coins nestled in felt. Their surfaces were tarnished, but they possessed the same unnatural weight. Spanish pieces of 8, Confederate half-dollars that Maria Santos claimed were never actually minted. She added my 3 coins to the collection. Each coin carries the tale of someone who died with unfinished business. Accept payment from a ghost, and you become entangled in their lingering affairs. The following morning, Mira Torres arrived at our dock, her battered fishing boat laden with supplies that suggested she took the supernatural aspects of Gulf Coast commerce more seriously than most people took their everyday jobs. She appeared to be in her 50s, with silver streaks in her hair and hands that moved with the grace of a conductor leading an invisible orchestra as she spoke. "Maria Santos," she called out, securing her boat with practiced efficiency. "The water's been acting strangely. Ripples that stop abruptly, wakes that don't correspond to the boats creating them." She climbed aboard with an easy familiarity, carrying a canvas bag that jingled with glass and metal. Protective charms, I realized, as I watched her unpack bundles of dried seaweed intertwined with salt crystals. That evening, Silas Ward showed up, trembling, claiming he heard his mother's voice calling to him from 20 feet below the surface. Maria Santos gave him a seaweed charm. "Rule number 4, she said to me, help the living protect themselves from the dead." The radio crackled, then began playing La Llorona, a mournful Spanish ballad about loss and the sea. "If that plays 3 times in one night," Maria Santos said, "we secure the boat and wait for dawn." The song faded, then started again. "That's 2, she said quietly. The 4th week brought changes I could sense in my bones before they registered visually. The Gulf's rhythm had altered, subtly at first, tide surging higher than weather predictions indicated, fog swirling against the prevailing wind, radio static forming patterns too deliberate to be random. Even the coffee, already burnt like diesel, tasted different, tinged with a briny edge that made my throat constrict as if I were underwater. Maria Santos noticed my disquiet during the morning net mending. I kept fumbling the stitches, my fingers rendered clumsy by a nameless anxiety. The work that had once been meditative now felt like attempting to repair something irreparably broken. "The blood moon's coming," she said without looking up from her section of the net. 3 nights from now. You can feel it building, can't you? Like the pressure before a storm, but deeper, older." She was right. The air itself felt thick, charged with a palpable electricity that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. I'd experienced something similar before hurricanes in Miami, that primal awareness of nature amassing its forces for destruction. But this was different. Less about weather than about something stirring, as if a colossal eye had flickered open beneath the waves. "What happens during a blood moon?" I asked, though a part of me already anticipated an answer I'd rather not hear. "The barrier thins. Things that usually remain buried rise to the surface." Maria Santos secured a section of the net with swift, practiced movements. "That's when the rules matter the most. Break them then, and the consequences don't dissipate with the daylight. That afternoon, she led me to a section of the Gulf Wraith I hadn't seen before. A cabin nestled behind the wheelhouse, accessible only through a hatch that appeared to be part of the original ship structure. The space was cramped, lined with mirrors that splintered our reflections into disorienting fragments. Rule number 5, Maria Santos said, positioning herself so I could see both her reflection and the deck behind us through the open hatch. Never trust mirrors after midnight. They reveal what's coming or what's gone, not necessarily what's present. She gestured toward one of the mirrors, and I saw something that triggered a primal smuggler's instinct, a warning I'd learned to heed. In the reflection, a shadow stood on the deck where no one should be, tall, clad in what appeared to be deck gear from a bygone era. But when I turned to look directly at the deck, there was nothing but afternoon sunlight and coiled rope. "See him?" Maria Santos asked. "That's Tommy Reeves. He worked this boat back in '92. Got tangled in the nets during a storm, went overboard. When you see crew in mirrors who aren't on deck, it means they're trying to convey something. Usually that death is approaching someone else." My skin prickled as I watched the shadowy figure point toward the water, its movements urgent despite the silence. Why doesn't he simply appear like the others? Some die too abruptly to learn the rules. They become trapped between what was and what is, only able to reach through reflections. Maria Santos adjusted one of the mirrors, and the figure became clearer. Tommy's been warning us about rough weather for 30 years. He's never wrong. That evening, Jasper Cole arrived at our dock, his boat riding so low in the water that I initially suspected he was taking on water. But as he tied off, I realized the weight was fear. It burdened him like lead ballast, slumping his shoulders and causing his normally steady hands to tremble as he secured the lines. "Maria Santos," he called out, his voice strained with the weight of a man who'd witnessed something that shattered his understanding of the world. "I need to talk. It's about the ripples." Jasper was a third-generation fisherman, one of the regulars who'd been working these waters since before I was born. If something had him spooked, it was worth paying attention to. He climbed aboard with the careful movements of someone whose confidence had been shaken. "7 ripples," he said without preamble. "Perfect line, each one about the size of a coffee can, pointing straight out toward the deep gulf. Started yesterday evening. Been there every time I check. My grandfather told stories about patterns like that." Vera's expression went stone hard. "Show me exactly where." Jasper led us to the bow and pointed toward a section of water about a quarter-mile out. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the normal chop of afternoon waves. Then the light shifted, and I caught sight of them. 7 circular disturbances in the water, evenly spaced and perfectly aligned, as if something beneath the surface was pressing upward with methodical precision. "Rule number 6, Vera said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. 7 ripples in a line means secure the boat. It's the Tide Eater's calling card, marking territory for the Blood Moon hunt." "What's the Tide Eater?" I asked, though the name alone was enough to make my mouth go dry. "Hunger given form. It feeds during blood moons, takes whatever's close to the ripples." Vera handed Jasper one of Mira Torres's charms, this one larger than the others, woven with what looked like fragments of mirror along with the usual seaweed and salt crystals. "Sprinkle salt around your boat, Jasper. Don't anchor anywhere near those ripples. And if you see them move closer to shore, you call everyone you know." The next morning brought Mira Torres back to our dock, but this time she wasn't carrying supplies. She was carrying news that made Vera's weather-beaten face go pale despite 4 decades of Gulf Coast horrors. "Dreams," Mira said, securing her boat with movements that suggested she'd been up all night. "Half the fishing community's having them, the ripples calling to people, promising easy catches, calm seas." Maria Santos saw her drowned brother standing in them, waving her closer. They conferred in rapid Spanish while I worked on maintenance tasks that suddenly felt pointless. The conversation was too fast for me to follow completely, but I caught enough to understand that whatever was coming wasn't limited to our boat. The entire coast was being tested, evaluated, marked for something that would happen when the moon turned red. "We need to distribute charms to everyone," Vera said finally, switching back to English. "Starting with the families closest to the water. Children are always the first targets." The mention of children made my chest tighten with thoughts of Lily in Tampa, safely distant from whatever ancient hunger was stirring in these waters. But the feeling also carried something else. A fierce protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity. These people had become something like family, and family was worth protecting, even when you'd betrayed your blood family in Miami. That night, alone in the mirror cabin while Vera handled the evening customers, I learned why rule number 5 mattered more than academic curiosity about the supernatural. The mirrors had been humming since sunset, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to vibrate in my bones rather than my ears. Fog pulsed beyond the windows like a living heart, and the radio downstairs kept cycling through stations that shouldn't exist. Children's songs in dead languages, weather reports for waters that weren't on any chart, sometimes what sounded like maritime emergencies from decades past. Just after midnight, the humming stopped. In the sudden silence, I saw him clearly. Not Tommy Reeves this time, but someone else entirely. An older man, wearing clothes that belonged to the 1890s, his face carrying the hard lines of someone who'd lived by violence and cunning. He stood in the mirror's reflection of the cabin, pointing urgently toward the water beyond the windows. "Silas Ward," Mira Torres's voice said behind me, though I hadn't heard her come aboard. "Smuggler from the old days, ran guns and rum through these waters during the Spanish-American War. If he's showing himself, it means big trouble's coming." I turned to find her standing in the hatch, her eyes reflecting the mirror's strange light. "How do you know who he is?" "Family stories. My great-grandmother was sane, worked with the spirits before the whites came and made everything complicated." She studied the figure in the mirror who continued his urgent pointing. "He warns of big trouble, the kind that changes everything." The radio crackled to life downstairs, and the familiar melody of La Llorona began to play. But this time, it felt different. Not random interference, but deliberate summoning, as if something was using the weeping woman's song to test the boundaries between worlds. "That's the second time tonight," Vera called from below. "One more, and we button up until dawn." Mira Torres and I exchanged glances. The blood moon was still 2 nights away, but the supernatural pressure was building faster than anyone had expected. In the mirror, Silas Ward's pointing became more frantic, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard distant voices carried on the fog. Children laughing, women weeping, men calling warnings in languages that predated European contact. The song faded, leaving behind silence that felt wrong in its completeness. Even the waves seemed muted, as if the Gulf itself was holding its breath. "It's starting early," Mira Torres whispered. "The barriers are weakening faster than usual." Outside, the fog began to thicken, and somewhere in the distance, I heard what might have been a woman singing or something else entirely that had learned to mimic human voices. The 7 ripples were still there, holding their perfect formation, but now they seemed larger, more defined. The blood moon was coming, and with it, something that had been waiting in the deep waters for its chance to hunt. The blood moon rose like a wound in the sky, casting everything in shades of copper and old blood. I had never seen anything like it. Not just red, but pulsing, as if something vast and hungry had opened its eye above the Gulf waters. The air itself felt different, thicker somehow, charged with an energy that set your teeth on edge and made your skin crawl with phantom electricity. Vera had anchored the Gulf Wraith early, guiding us into a sheltered cove where the water was unnaturally still, and the mangroves formed a natural barricade against whatever horrors were coming. She'd been preparing since the first light of dawn, moving with the focused intensity of someone who'd weathered these storms before, someone who knew precisely how high the stakes truly were. "Tonight's different, Silas," she told me as we secured extra mooring lines and gave the radio equipment one last, desperate check. "Blood moons only come every few years, but when they do arrive, the veil between worlds thins to gossamer. Things that usually remain buried beneath the waves rise for air." She led me below deck to a storage area I'd never laid eyes on before, accessible only through a cleverly concealed hatch hidden behind the engine compartment. The confined space was cramped and oppressively humid, with coral formations on the walls that seemed to have grown organically rather than been constructed. Jars filled with preserved seaweed stood in neat rows on makeshift shelves, and dozens upon dozens of photographs were tacked to every available surface, images of the Gulf in all its moods. During raging storms, during uncanny calms, during moments when the water moved in ways that defied the very laws of physics. The air hung heavy with the smell of brine and something far older, something that evoked the feeling of submerged caves deep underwater, where sunlight had never dared to penetrate. Every breath was saturated with the taste of salt and long-forgotten secrets, of knowledge that wasn't intended for those of us who lived our lives above the waves. The tide eater claims those near ripples, Vera said, her weathered finger pointing to several disturbing photographs that depicted water spiraling inward with unnatural precision, creating patterns that were almost painful to look at directly. It feeds voraciously during blood moons, dragging souls down to whatever abyssal depth it calls home. The photos reveal what your unaided eyes cannot. The predatory feeding tendrils, the shadow tides that carry unsuspecting people away to their doom. I studied the unsettling images, desperately trying to make sense of what I was seeing. In some, the water appeared almost deceptively normal. In others, amorphous dark shapes moved just beneath the surface, reaching upward with appendages that seemed to be composed of liquid shadow itself. The most disturbing ones showed people in boats, their faces strangely serene and peaceful, utterly oblivious to the monstrous presence that was rising inexorably toward them from the inky depths below. Why photos? I asked, even though a part of me already instinctively understood the answer. Cameras don't deceive in the way that eyes do. They capture what's actually there, not what something wants you to perceive. She handed me an ancient Polaroid camera, its body worn smooth by what must have been decades of constant handling. Keep this with you tonight, Silas. Trust what it reveals to you, not what your fallible senses might be telling you. By evening, the small community had gathered in our cramped, stifling below-decks refuge. Jasper Cole sat silently in one corner, methodically cleaning a well-worn fishing knife, his gaze riveted to the unsettling photographs showing those strange, swirling ripple patterns. Mira Torres had brought additional protective charms, far more intricate than any I'd seen before, woven with materials that seemed to have been harvested from the deepest trenches and the lightless places where normal light had no hope of reaching. 17 people in the past 50 years, Vera said, reviewing a worn, handwritten ledger by the flickering light of battery-powered lanterns. All taken during blood moons, all in close proximity to the 7 ripple formations. The Gulf remembers each and every one of them, and the Tide Eater uses their stolen voices to lure new victims to their watery graves. The boat began to rock gently as the blood moon reached its zenith, and that's when the humming began. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, a low-frequency vibration that resonated deep within my bones rather than simply reaching my ears. The photographs on the walls began to flutter erratically despite the complete absence of any discernible wind, and in several of them, I could clearly see the dark, amorphous shapes moving far more actively than before, as if the blood moon's crimson light had awakened something that had been dormant, sleeping in the blackest depths. "It's starting," Mira whispered, clutching a charm made of rough salt crystals and what appeared to be fragments of incredibly old glass. "Everyone stay below deck. No matter what you hear, do not, under any circumstances, go topside." The humming intensified, growing stronger with each passing moment, and with it came other, more disturbing sounds. A faint scratching against the hull, as if something with impossibly long, skeletal fingers was testing the strength of our defenses. The radio crackled to life, cycling through bursts of static and fragments of voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, some of which might not have been human languages at all. Through the small, grime-streaked porthole, I could see the water around us beginning to swirl and churn in patterns that defied both current and wind. 7 perfectly formed circles appeared in a straight line, pointing directly toward the deeper, more treacherous waters of the Gulf, each one pulsing with the same unsettling rhythm as the bone-jarring humming that filled the cramped space. In the photographs, the predatory feeding tendrils became sickeningly visible dark, ropey appendages reaching up from unfathomable depths that had never been properly mapped by any human hand. That's when I heard Maria Holt's voice. "Silas," she called, her voice carrying perfectly through the blood moon night despite the fact that she was hundreds of miles away in Tampa. "Silas, I'm drowning. Please help me." Every instinct I had developed as a father, every protective impulse that had driven me to send money to Nora despite my own desperate circumstances, screamed at me to respond to her desperate plea. I was already moving toward the ladder before conscious thought could stop me, driven by the kind of primal, parental panic that overrides every other consideration. "Don't," Vera said sharply, her voice laced with urgency. But I was already climbing, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I pushed open the heavy hatch. The deck was awash in blood-red moonlight, and there, standing at the bow of the boat, were Nora and Maria Holt. My ex-wife looked exactly as she had the last time I'd seen her, wearing the same simple blue dress she'd worn to our divorce proceedings. Maria Holt looked like she'd grown taller since our last video call, but she was crying, reaching toward the water with small, trembling hands that betrayed her terror. "Daddy," she sobbed, her voice filled with anguish. "I fell in the water, and I can't swim anymore. The lady says you have to come get me." Behind them, barely visible in the eerie, distorted light, stood a tall, gaunt figure shrouded in an oil-slick coat. Its face was an unnerving, smooth, blank, featureless as a lifeless mannequin. But its very presence radiated a bone-chilling cold that, the October night felt like a winter siege in the Arctic. The Tide Eater, that's what it was. The thing that gorged itself during blood moons, using the stolen voices of the lost to bait the living. "Trust the camera, not your eyes?" Maria Holt called from below, and I gripped the Polaroid in my hands, remembering. I raised it and snapped a picture, the flash cutting through the darkness, briefly painting the deck in harsh white light. The developing image revealed only the Tide Eater, a solitary figure standing at the bow, its featureless face turned toward me, radiating the patient hunger of something that had waited eons to feed. Nora and Lily were illusions, echoes borrowed from the drowned souls the Gulf had claimed, manifestations of my own guilt and fear, given form by something that knew precisely how to inflict the deepest pain. "Offer a memory trade," Maria Holt shouted from below. "Give it something it wants more than your life." The Tide Eater advanced, and I felt its attention like ice water infiltrating my veins. The cold clawed at my mind, desperately searching for something valuable enough to appease its hunger. It craved memories, not just any memories, but the ones that defined me, the ones that shaped my choices, the ones that had led me to this very precipice. I thought of Lily's real laugh, a stark contrast to the mournful echo I had just heard. I thought of the moment I had betrayed my crew back in Miami, the crushing weight of that decision and everything it had cost me. I thought of my first day on the Gulf Wraith, the way Maria Holt had looked at me, seeing something redeemable despite all evidence to the contrary. "My first day here," I said aloud, the words ripped from my throat by a cold that felt like drowning in reverse. "The memory of how I came to work on this boat. Take it." The Tide Eater's featureless face tilted, as if weighing the offer. Then, a tidal wave of cold crashed through my mind, tearing away images and sensations I'd carried for weeks. The conversation with Maria Holt at Mira Torres's bait shop, the first glimpse of the Gulf Wraith, the moment I decided this job was my chance at redemption. All of it dissolving like sugar in the rain. Lily's voice vanished with it, along with the illusion of Nora and the suffocating presence of the creature that had been manipulating their images to lure me to my death. The Tide Eater retreated into the shadows and mist, carrying my memory away to whatever abyssal depths it called home. Dawn broke, gray and unremarkable, the blood moon's crimson stain fading as normal sunlight reclaimed the Gulf. But when Maria Holt asked me how I had ended up working on the Gulf Wraith, the memory was gone. The weeks between leaving Miami and standing on that deck were erased, replaced by a void that felt like a missing tooth. I knew I was running from something, knew I had a daughter in Tampa who desperately needed money I couldn't afford to send, but how I'd arrived here, how I'd learned the rules that govern survival on these treacherous waters. All of that now belonged to the Tide Eater, payment for a life that should have been forfeited. The Gulf lapped gently against our hull, as innocent as baptismal water in the morning light. The weeks that followed the blood moon passed in a daze of unanswerable questions and work that felt strangely familiar despite the gaping hole in my memory. My hands instinctively knew how to mend nets. My body understood the Gulf Wraith's rhythms. But when I tried to recall my first day aboard, I found only empty space where those memories should have resided. The absence was a constant irritant. Like a missing tooth, I couldn't stop probing with my tongue. Maria Holt watched me struggle with the quiet understanding of someone who had witnessed this before. During the morning coffee ritual that had become our routine, she would retrieve photographs from a shoebox she kept in the wheelhouse. Pictures of me during those first weeks I could no longer recall. There I was, learning to coil rope, looking skeptical as she explained the rules, standing beside her as we served fuel to fishermen whose names I still remembered. "You adapted fast," she said, studying a photo of me checking the radio equipment with the focused attention of someone who understood its importance. Like my Silas Ward. He had that same look when he was learning something that mattered. The photos were proof that I had been there, but they felt like documentation of someone else's life. I could see the progression from weariness to acceptance in my own face, watch myself transforming into a part of something larger than mere survival. But the emotional weight of those moments, the memories that should have imbued them with meaning, now belonged to the Tide Eater. "Why that memory specifically?" I asked, running my fingers along the edge of a photograph that showed me standing with Maria Holt at sunset, both of us gazing toward the Gulf with expressions that suggested we were discussing something of grave importance. "Because it was the moment you chose to stay," Maria Holt said, her weathered hands steady on her coffee cup. "Most people who find this boat leave within a week. You decided to become part of its protection instead of just passing through. That choice was valuable enough to satisfy what took it." The work continued despite the gaps in my knowledge. My hands performed tasks my mind couldn't place, and gradually, I began to feel less like an actor playing a role and more like someone piecing himself back together from shattered fragments. The Gulf helped. Its relentless rhythms demanded attention, leaving little room for dwelling on what was missing. That's when Maria Santos came back into my life, though for me, it was as if we were meeting for the first time. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 6th week, stepping onto the Gulf Wraith with the casual confidence of someone who'd been visiting this boat her entire life. Mid-20s, with her grandmother's sharp eyes and dark hair that caught the morning light like spun copper. She wore scrubs under a light jacket. A nurse coming off the night shift, I learned later, and carried a small canvas bag that clinked softly when she moved. "Hello, Caleb," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that suggested a history, a familiarity I couldn't access. "How are you feeling?" "Vera told me about the memory trade," I said, studying her face, searching for a spark of recognition that remained stubbornly absent. Pretty, undeniably kind, with a smile that promised immediate trust. But whatever connection had existed between us was lost in the memory space claimed by the Tide Eater. "I'm sorry," I said, hating the hollow sound of the words. "I don't remember you." Something flickered across her face, a brief shadow of hurt, perhaps, or disappointment, but she quickly masked it. "That's okay." We walked the shore a few times, talked about Lily. "You showed me photos of her, told me about Tampa and how much you missed being a proper father." The mention of my daughter sent a jolt of recognition through me, a fierce and protective instinct. That bond remained untouched, shielded by something deeper than the traded memories. Whatever the Tide Eater had taken, it hadn't severed my connection to Lily. I started, then hesitated, unsure how to frame the question. "Dating might be too strong a word," Maria Santos said, pulling shells from her canvas bag and arranging them on the boat's rail with meticulous precision. "Getting to know each other. You were still figuring out who you wanted to be, now that you'd stopped running." She continued her work as she spoke, placing each shell with the deliberate care of a ritual. The shells themselves were beautiful, perfect spirals and smooth curves that seemed to absorb and reflect the light like polished bone. But their arrangement felt purposeful, imbued with a significance I was only beginning to grasp. "For Elias Cole," she explained when she noticed me watching, "the drowned rider. These mark his passage. Let him know someone remembers what he was before he became what he is now." Even the dead deserve that kind of respect. It was exactly the kind of gesture that would have resonated with me. I realized a practical compassion extended towards something most people would dismiss as mere superstition, the mark of a woman who could accept the supernatural realities of the Gulf Coast while still maintaining her own humanity. The federal investigation arrived that afternoon like storm clouds amassing on a clear horizon. Agent Maria Holt was everything I'd learned to distrust during my years of smuggling. Crisp suit, sharp eyes, the kind of professional competence that could dissect carefully constructed lies with surgical precision. She arrived with 2 junior agents and a file thick enough to suggest they'd been investigating Gulf Coast disappearances for months. "Mr. Reed," she said, displaying her credentials with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed the same task thousands of times. "I understand you work nights on this vessel. We're investigating several missing persons reports, tourists who were last seen in this area." Vera emerged from the wheelhouse before I could respond, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who had anticipated this confrontation. "Agents, what can we do for you? We're looking into the disappearance of Emma Lyle, a tourist from Ohio who rented a boat 3 weeks ago." Agent Holt continued, consulting her notes. "Her vessel was found empty, drifting about 2 miles from this dock. No distress signal, no signs of struggle." The name sparked something, not a complete memory, but a faint echo of recognition. Emma Lyle. Blonde, mid-30s, adorned with expensive gear that screamed of someone who had bought their way into Gulf Coast fishing without truly understanding its inherent dangers. I could see her face clearly. Remember the way she peppered me with questions about the deeper channels where the larger fish ran. "I remember her," I said carefully. "She bought fuel here, asked about fishing spots. Seemed inexperienced, but determined." "When was this?" Agent Holt's pen was already scratching across her notepad. 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. Late evening, around the time the commercial fishermen head out. I paused, choosing my words with deliberation. She was asking about areas that even experienced locals avoid. I told her to stay close to shore. "They're close to the shadow tides," Vera said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of one who understood precisely what we were facing. Agent Holt looked up sharply, her gaze piercing. "Shadow tides? Local phenomenon," Vera said with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to explain the inexplicable to skeptical outsiders. "Unusual current patterns that can be dangerous for inexperienced boaters. We always recommend staying in the marked channels." That evening, after the agents had taken their statements and departed with thinly veiled promises to return, Vera led me to a section of the Gulf Wraith I'd never encountered before. A cabin concealed behind the engine compartment, accessible only through a hatch cleverly disguised as part of the boat's original structure. The space was cramped and humid, lined with mirrors that fractured our reflections into unsettling angles. But it was the ledger that commanded my attention, a handwritten record spanning decades, chronicling names, dates, and the unsettling circumstances surrounding disappearances. "The Gulf Wraith isn't just a fishing boat," Vera said, opening the ledger to pages yellowed with age. "It's an anchor point. Shadow tides are supernatural currents that flow between this world and whatever lies beneath. Without something to hold them stable, they'd sweep away everything in their path." I scanned the entries, recognizing certain names from Coast Guard reports and local newspaper stories. Emma Lyle was there, along with dozens of others, their fates stretching back to the 1980s. Each entry was methodical, clinical. Name, age, last known location, phase of the moon, accompanied by terse notes about supernatural activity in the immediate area. "Every person lost to the shadow tide strengthens them," Vera continued, carefully adjusting one of the mirrors so I could glimpse the water beyond the cabin windows. "That's why the rules exist. To protect people who don't understand what they're dealing with. To maintain the balance that keeps worse things from coming through." As Maria Holt spoke, the radio sputtered to life, crackling with static that resolved into patterns too ordered to be random, too deliberate to be mere chance. In the cabin mirrors, I saw them, figures shifting beneath the water's surface, shapes that might once have been human, reaching upward with desperate gestures, forever barred from breaching the boundary between the worlds. "Someone has to watch," Maria Holt said simply, her gaze steady. Someone has to maintain the rules, help the living avoid the fate of the dead, keep the anchor point stable. It's not a job you can quit, and it's not something you can do halfway. The epilogue of my old life arrived a week later when the shadow tide claimed the tourist skiff. Mira Torres and I were rebuilding something akin to friendship, carefully piecing together a relationship from fragments and possibilities rather than shared histories. "You told me you wanted to be the kind of father Lily could be proud of," she said, watching the sunset paint the Gulf in hues of copper and gold. Someone who protected things instead of just taking them. It struck me then, with the force of revelation, that this was precisely the man I yearned to become, a guardian instead of a schemer, someone who built instead of destroyed for profit. The smuggler who had betrayed his crew back in Miami felt like a character from a forgotten story, a cautionary tale about choices leading to ruin. The skiff materialized just as darkness fully enveloped the Gulf, a small vessel with running lights that flickered uncertainly in the encroaching fog. Through binoculars, I could make out two figures aboard, tourists, judging by their posture and the expensive gear scattered on deck. Then the water around them began to writhe, to move with an unnatural purpose. It started with ripples that defied the wind's direction, circles expanding outward from an unseen source. The skiff's engine coughed, sputtered, and died, leaving them adrift in waters that mirrored stars despite the overcast sky. One of the figures stood, pointing toward shore with movements that seemed too deliberate, too directed. "Shadow tide," Maria Holt murmured, appearing beside me, the ledger already open to a blank page. "They're being pulled into the current." I raised the camera she had taught me to trust, snapping photos that would reveal what our naked eyes could not perceive. The developed images confirmed the dread. Tendrils of liquid shadow rising from depths unmapped, wrapping around the skiff's hull with the patient hunger of something that had waited an eternity to feed. By the time the Coast Guard arrived to investigate the abandoned vessel, all that remained was an empty boat and a collection of questions that offered no answers acceptable to any federal investigator. "Drowned rider's light cuts the fog," I wrote in the ledger that night, documenting the encounter with the methodical precision Maria Holt had instilled in me. Asterisk, two souls taken to whatever depth calls them home. The anchor holds. Someone stands watch. Asterisk, I closed the ledger and settled into the mirror cabin, accepting the weight of guardianship that had chosen me as surely as I had chosen it. Outside, the Gulf lapped against our hull with the gentle persistence of something vast and patient, carrying voices that would never be heard and debts that would never be repaid. The drowned rider's light appeared on schedule, moving across the water in its eternal search for something that would never be found. I acknowledged it with the deck lights, maintaining the truce that kept worse things at bay, and settled in for another night of watching over waters where the living and the dead shared the same dark currents.